Imagine waking up in a world where everything you know, your country, your culture, your identity, has been rewritten by the victors of a war that ended decades ago. The year is 2024, but this is not the world you recognize. Berlin is the capital of a global empire. The streets are lined with giant statues of Adolf Hitler, his face imprinted on every banknote, his ideology embedded in every law. The United States does not exist as you know it. It has been annexed, its democracy dismantled, replaced by the iron rule of the Third Reich. A voice crackles through loudspeakers on every street corner. Loyal citizens, today marks 79 years of the German Reich's rule over the world. Our victory in World War II ensured global unity under one supreme power. You check your phone. It is not Apple, not Samsung, not even a brand you know. It is Deutsche Elektronik, controlled by the Nazi government. The internet? Censored. No foreign news. No history books that tell any other story than the victory of the Aryan race. The world as we know it, free speech, democracy, diversity, never existed. Because in this reality, Adolf Hitler won World War II. But how did this happen? Where did history take a different turn? And more importantly, what would the world look like today under Nazi rule? That is what we are about to explore. What key moments in World War II could have changed history? What kind of society would Hitler have created if he ruled the world? How would technology, culture, and daily life be different? And most importantly, would his empire have lasted or collapsed under its own weight? These are the questions we are about to answer. If history had taken a different turn, you would not be watching this freely. You would be living it. History is shaped by moments, single decisions that alter the course of entire civilizations. World War II was no different. A handful of critical battles, strategic alliances, and technological advancements determined the outcome. But what if those moments had played out differently? What if Germany had won the battles that sealed its fate? What if its allies had been stronger? What if the United States had never entered the war? If just a few key events had unfolded in Hitler's favor, the world we live in today would have been unrecognizable. In 1942, Germany launched an invasion into the Soviet Union, aiming to capture Stalingrad, a vital industrial and strategic hub. It was supposed to be a decisive victory, but it turned into Hitler's worst nightmare. The Soviet Red Army, despite massive casualties, surrounded the German Sixth Army, cutting off their supplies and forcing them into surrender. But what if Germany had won? Had Hitler listened to his generals and focused on securing oil fields in the Caucasus rather than stubbornly holding Stalingrad, the German war machine would have had the fuel it desperately needed. If reinforcements had arrived in time, the Soviet forces could have collapsed, allowing Germany to take Moscow. A defeated Soviet Union would have changed everything. No Eastern Front resistance, no Red Army pushing back toward Berlin. Instead, Nazi Germany would have controlled all of Europe and turned its full attention westward to Britain and America. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The day the Allies launched their most ambitious military operation, landing over 150,000 troops on the beaches of Normandy to break Hitler's grip on Western Europe. The landings were a turning point, opening a new front against Germany. But what if D-Day had failed? Had Hitler deployed his panzer divisions immediately instead of hesitating? Had the stormy weather continued for just a few more days? Or had the German Navy intercepted the Allied fleet? The invasion could have been repelled. With no successful landing in France, the Western Allies would have been stuck, unable to launch a European offensive. Britain would have remained isolated, and the United States might have reconsidered its involvement in Europe. A failed D-Day would have left Nazi Germany dominant, forcing the Allies into negotiations rather than total victory. Germany and Japan were allies, but their coordination was weak. Japan focused on the Pacific, fighting the United States, while Germany battled in Europe. But what if Japan had struck the Soviet Union from the east, forcing Stalin into a two-front war? The Soviets would have been overwhelmed, and Japan could have expanded into Siberia instead of stretching itself thin across the Pacific. A stronger Japan would have meant a weaker United States, with America forced to divide its forces across two major wars. This scenario could have led to an Axis-controlled Eurasia, leaving Britain and the remnants of the Allies with no real chance of victory. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 brought the United States into the war. It was a turning point, shifting the balance of power completely. But what if America had not entered so soon? If Japan had avoided attacking Pearl Harbor, the United States might have delayed its involvement. Without America's massive industrial and military power, Britain and the Soviet Union would have struggled against Germany. By the time the United States eventually joined, it could have been too late. Nazi Germany could have consolidated its rule over Europe, built stronger defenses, and even forced peace treaties before America could fully intervene. While the Allies were secretly developing the atomic bomb through the Manhattan Project, Germany had its own nuclear program, but it lacked resources, funding, and proper leadership. But what if Hitler had successfully developed nuclear weapons before the United States? With atomic bombs in Nazi hands, Germany could have obliterated London, Moscow, or even New York. The mere threat of nuclear destruction might have forced the Allies into surrender. A Nazi-controlled world, armed with nuclear weapons, would have been unstoppable. Each of these turning points could have changed history. A German victory in Stalingrad could have crushed the Soviet Union. A failed D-Day could have prevented the Allies from liberating Europe. A stronger Japan could have overwhelmed both the United States and the Soviet Union. A delayed American entry could have given Germany the time it needed to secure its empire. A successful Nazi nuclear program could have ended the war on Hitler's terms. Had any of these events gone differently, Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich might not have been just a fantasy. It could have been reality. Would this world have lasted? Or would internal resistance, rebellions, and inevitable conflicts have led to its downfall? That is what we explore next. History remembers Nazi Germany as a brutal regime that collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. But what if it had not? What if, instead of defeat, Hitler had achieved his ultimate vision, a world dominated by the Third Reich? If Nazi Germany had emerged victorious, the world would have been reshaped under a terrifying new order. Borders would have been redrawn, entire populations displaced or exterminated, and global politics permanently altered. The effects of a Nazi-controlled world would have reached every continent, shaping Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas in unimaginable ways. This is what that world might have looked like. A Nazi victory in World War II would have turned Europe into a vast German empire. The conquest of France, Britain, and the Soviet Union would have created a totalitarian superstate stretching from the Atlantic to the Ural Mountains. After the fall of France in 1940, Germany installed the Vichy government, a puppet regime. However, had Germany fully conquered Britain as well, a similar fate would have awaited the British people. Winston Churchill would have been executed or exiled, the monarchy abolished, and Nazi sympathizers placed in power. London, once the center of democracy, would have been turned into a German outpost. France and Britain's economies would have been drained to fuel the Nazi war machine. Their people, especially Jews, political dissidents, and other targeted groups, would have faced systematic persecution. The English and French languages might have been replaced by German as the official language of government and education. If Hitler had won the Battle of Stalingrad and captured Moscow, the Soviet Union would have collapsed. The Nazis planned to enslave or exterminate millions of Slavs, whom they considered inferior. The fertile lands of Ukraine and Russia would have been transformed into German settlements, with Slavic populations reduced to forced labor. Would resistance have continued? Possibly. The sheer size of the Soviet Union means that guerrilla warfare and uprisings could have persisted for years. But with Nazi control over Soviet resources and industry, the dream of communist resistance would have been shattered. A Nazi victory would not have only reshaped Europe, it would have had a devastating impact on Asia and Africa as well. Japan, Nazi Germany's strongest ally, would have expanded aggressively throughout Asia. With Britain and the United States neutralized, Japan would have taken full control over China, Southeast Asia, and possibly even India. The Pacific would have become a Japanese-dominated territory, with no American naval power to stop its expansion. Would Germany and Japan have remained allies forever? Unlikely. Both powers had their own ambitions, and conflicts over territory, especially in the Soviet Union and Central Asia, could have led to a future war between the two. However, at least in the early years of their victory, the Axis powers would have completely reshaped the map of Asia. With Britain and France defeated, their African colonies would have been up for grabs. Germany would have likely reinstated its pre-World War I colonies, taking control of Namibia, Tanzania, and Cameroon. But Hitler's true vision for Africa was far darker. The Nazis saw Africa as a land to be exploited. Millions of native Africans would have been forced into labor camps, supplying raw materials for the German war machine. Unlike the British and French colonial rulers, who at least maintained some form of local governance, The Nazis would have imposed total racial segregation, exterminating or enslaving entire populations. Would resistance have emerged? Absolutely. But with no allied forces to support African rebellions, any attempt at independence would have been brutally crushed. Even if Nazi Germany had won the war, total world domination would not have been immediate. Some nations would have remained beyond Hitler's grasp, at least temporarily. Had the United States stayed out of the war or failed to defeat Germany, it would have remained the last major industrial power outside the Nazi sphere of influence. Would this have led to a Cold War between the U.S. and Nazi Germany? Most likely, yes. America, with its massive industrial base and nuclear capabilities, would have been the last global force capable of resisting Nazi expansion. However, without the moral victory of defeating the Nazis in World War II, internal divisions could have weakened the country. A peace treaty with Germany might have been signed, leading to an uneasy truce. However, just like the Cold War with the Soviet Union, tensions would have remained high. A nuclear arms race between the U.S. and Nazi Germany could have shaped the second half of the 20th century. Instead of the space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, imagine a technological war between Washington and Berlin, each trying to outmatch the other in weapons, science, and global influence. Would a conflict have eventually broken out? Possibly. A Nazi-led world would have been inherently unstable, with Hitler's successors fighting for power and new enemies emerging. South America, which remained neutral for most of World War II, could have been pressured into aligning with the Axis. Argentina, already harboring pro-Nazi sympathies, might have become Germany's main ally in the region. The Middle East, rich in oil, would have been a key battleground. With Britain out of the picture, Nazi Germany would have sought full control over the region's energy supply. Would local Arab leaders have cooperated? Some might have, seeing Germany as a counterbalance to British and French colonial rule. Others would have resisted, sparking conflicts that could have shaped the geopolitics of the region for decades. A Nazi-controlled world would have been brutal, oppressive, and unstable. But would it have lasted? History suggests that totalitarian regimes, no matter how powerful, do not endure forever. Internal power struggles, economic difficulties, and resistance movements would have threatened the empire. Without a strong, charismatic leader like Hitler, his successors might have weakened the regime through internal conflicts. Rebellions could have emerged across Europe, Asia, and Africa, slowly chipping away at Nazi control. Eventually, the empire might have crumbled under its own weight, much like the Soviet Union did in the late 20th century. However, the cost of such a future would have been unimaginable. Entire cultures wiped out, generations living under totalitarian rule, a world where freedom, democracy, and human rights were nothing more than forgotten concepts. In this alternate reality, victory would not have meant peace. It would have meant the darkest chapter in human history, continuing indefinitely. Would the world have fought back? Maybe. But under the iron fist of the Third Reich, resistance would have come at a price too horrific to imagine. This is the world that could have been. This is the nightmare that never happened. If Nazi Germany had won World War II, the world would not only have been politically and militarily dominated by Hitler's vision, but society itself would have been reshaped under his brutal ideology. Every aspect of life, education, science, technology, culture, and daily existence would have been dictated by Nazi principles. This is what society under a victorious Nazi regime might have looked like. Hitler's long-term plan for global domination was based on a concept he called the New Order, a world where Nazi ideology controlled every aspect of life. The racial hierarchy would have been absolute, with Germans and other Aryans at the top, while Jews, Slavs, and other so-called undesirables were either exterminated or enslaved. Racial policies. The Holocaust would not have ended in 1945 but would have continued, expanding to every occupied country. Entire ethnic groups, particularly Slavs, would have been systematically wiped out or reduced to a permanent underclass of laborers. Social hierarchy. Nazi Germany already had a strict classification system based on racial purity, loyalty to the state, and physical fitness. Had the Nazis won, this would have expanded globally. Non-Germans would have been forced to accept inferior status or face extermination. Eugenics and population control. The Nazi government promoted selective breeding to strengthen the Aryan race. Over time, forced sterilizations, genetic manipulation, and population control methods would have been used to create Hitler's vision of a perfect society. Had Nazi Germany succeeded, the world would have been divided into two groups, the rulers and the ruled. Freedom, democracy, and human rights would have been non-existent concepts. One of the Nazis' most powerful tools was education as indoctrination. Had they won the war, they would have expanded their control over schools and universities, shaping future generations to be completely loyal to their ideology. Schools would have been propaganda factories. Children would have been taught that the Nazi worldview was the only truth. History books would have been rewritten to glorify Hitler and erase any narrative that contradicted Nazi beliefs. Science and philosophy would have been censored. Any academic discipline that conflicted with Nazi ideology, such as psychology, certain branches of physics and philosophy, would have been banned or rewritten. Compulsory military training. Boys would have been raised as future soldiers, while girls would have been trained to be mothers of the Aryan race. This system would have ensured total loyalty from childhood. The ultimate goal of Nazi education was not to create critical thinkers, but obedient subjects who never questioned the right. Despite its brutal ideology, Nazi Germany was highly advanced in certain areas of science and technology. Had Hitler won, these advancements would have accelerated, but only in directions that served the regime's goals. Nazi Germany had some of the world's most advanced rocket scientists, including Wernher von Braun, who later helped the United States land on the moon. Had the Nazis won, they would have likely been the first to dominate space exploration. The V-2 rocket, which was used as a weapon, could have been expanded into intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, giving Nazi Germany the power to strike anywhere in the world. A Nazi-controlled moon landing? With Hitler's obsession with power, space would have been militarized rather than used for peaceful exploration. Instead of planting a U.S. flag on the moon in 1969, a Nazi swastika might have been the first flag on another celestial body. Had Nazi Germany survived into the modern technological age, artificial intelligence, AI, would have been used for mass surveillance, population control, and propaganda. A total surveillance state. Nazi Germany already had a sophisticated network of informants and secret police, the Gestapo. AI and computer technology would have enhanced their ability to monitor, control, and manipulate the population. Censorship and thought control. The internet, if it had developed under Nazi rule, would have been entirely state-controlled, with all information filtered through propaganda channels. Dissent would have been impossible. During World War II, Nazi Germany attempted to develop nuclear weapons, but failed due to a lack of resources and scientific cooperation. Had they won, they could have succeeded in creating nuclear bombs, leading to a global arms race against the United States or Japan. With nuclear power at their disposal, the Nazis would have used it to intimidate any remaining enemies into submission, build a network of nuclear-armed German bases around the world, power Nazi cities with advanced nuclear technology, while other nations remain dependent on outdated energy sources. A nuclear-armed Nazi Germany would have been a terrifying global superpower. Had Nazi Germany shaped the world's culture, creativity and diversity would have been stifled. Only government-approved art, literature, and music would have been allowed. Hollywood would not have existed. The film industry, heavily influenced by Jewish, African American, and other diverse voices, would have been completely erased. Instead, film would have been used purely as a propaganda tool. Censorship of all foreign influences. Anything perceived as degenerate art, such as jazz, modernist paintings, or anything created by non-Aryans, would have been banned. Only Nazi-approved, state-controlled media would have been allowed. Books promoting freedom, democracy, or equality would have been destroyed. Writers who opposed the regime would have been silenced or executed. The only literature available would have been those that glorified Nazi ideals. No diverse voices. Works by Jewish, Slavic, or other minority authors would have been erased from history. Philosophy rewritten. Thinkers like Nietzsche, whose ideas were distorted by the Nazis, would have been reshaped into pure propaganda tools. No jazz, blues, or modern music. Hitler despised jazz and any music with African or Jewish influences. The only acceptable music would have been German classical compositions and militaristic anthems. Art would have been strictly controlled. Modern art movements like Surrealism and Cubism would have been banned. Only Nazi-approved, hyper-traditional artwork glorifying the Aryan race and Nazi ideals would have been permitted. A Nazi-controlled society might have appeared powerful on the surface, but it would have been built on oppression, censorship, and fear. Internal rebellion. The more oppressive a system, the more likely resistance movements will rise. Underground movements, similar to today's dissidents in authoritarian states, would have formed. Economic instability. Nazi policies were unsustainable in the long term. The empire would have struggled to maintain its control over occupied territories. Technological stagnation. While Nazi Germany might have made some scientific advances, banning free thought and diverse contributions would have eventually slowed progress. Had Nazi Germany won, the world would have been a darker, more brutal place. But history shows that oppressive regimes rarely last forever. Over time, cracks would have formed, leading to eventual collapse. This is what might have been. This is the nightmare that never came true. If Hitler had won World War II, the world would have been plunged into an era of brutal oppression under Nazi rule. However, history has shown that no empire lasts forever, especially one built on tyranny. Even in a world where Nazi Germany reigned supreme, resistance and rebellion would have been inevitable. In this scenario, underground movements, secret missions, and proxy wars would have played a critical role in challenging the Nazi Empire. But the ultimate question remains. Could the Third Reich have sustained its rule, or would it have eventually collapsed under its own weight? The underground resistance, fighting from the shadows. The first line of resistance against the victorious Nazi regime would have come from underground movements. Brave individuals and groups working in secrecy to disrupt, sabotage, and undermine the system. Even during the actual war, resistance movements operated across Nazi-occupied Europe. Had the Nazis won, these groups would have either been crushed or evolved into even more sophisticated networks. French Resistance 2.0. The original French resistance fought valiantly against German occupation. If Hitler had secured total victory, an underground war would have continued for decades, using guerrilla tactics, assassinations, and espionage to weaken Nazi control over Europe. British Underground Army. Had Britain fallen, its citizens would have never fully accepted Nazi rule. A secret resistance, possibly backed by an exiled royal family or government in hiding, would have worked from underground bases, carrying out bombings and intelligence operations. Soviet partisan movements. Even if the Soviet Union had been conquered, remnants of the Red Army and communist loyalists would have formed a deep resistance movement in the vast Russian terrain, waging an unrelenting guerrilla war against Nazi occupation. Each of these movements would have been driven by a single belief: Nazism must be destroyed at any cost. The role of spy networks. Espionage would have played a crucial role in the resistance. Nations like the United States, Britain, if it had survived, and a possible Soviet government in exile would have continued running covert operations, gathering intelligence and training rebel forces to fight back. Double agents in the Reich. Some Germans who disagreed with Hitler would have secretly worked for the resistance, leaking military strategies, nuclear development plans, and political secrets. Code breakers and cyber warfare. Had the war extended into the late 20th century, cyber warfare would have played a role in hacking Nazi communication networks and spreading anti-regime propaganda. Assassination attempts on Nazi leaders. The Nazi leadership would have been the primary target of secret missions, aiming to destabilize the Reich from within. Despite the Nazi regime's brutal security measures, covert operations would have ensured that resistance never truly died. America and USSR's counterstrategy. The Cold War against Nazism. If Hitler had won in Europe, America and the Soviet Union would have become the last major opposition forces, leading to a global Cold War between Nazi Germany and the rest of the world. Had Nazi Germany won the war, America's role in global politics would have completely changed. With Europe under Hitler's rule, the U.S. would have become the epicenter of anti-Nazi resistance, funding rebel groups and leading an arms race against the Reich. The Manhattan Project accelerates. The United States, having already developed nuclear weapons, would have expanded its arsenal, preparing for a potential war against Nazi Germany. Proxy wars in Latin America and Africa. Just as the real-world Cold War saw conflicts in Vietnam and Korea, America might have supported anti-Nazi uprisings in South America and Africa, fueling global resistance against the Reich. Nazi espionage in America. Hitler would have deployed German spies to infiltrate U.S. institutions, sabotage military operations, and spread Nazi propaganda to weaken American resolve. The battle between Nazi Germany and the United States would have been a long and brutal ideological war, one fought not just with weapons, but with information, espionage, and economic power. If the USSR had fallen, not all of its leaders and military forces would have been killed. A Soviet government in exile, possibly operating from the mountains of Siberia or from China, would have continued its fight against Nazism. Soviet guerrilla warfare. Soviet troops, trained in harsh winter conditions, would have continued to wage an underground war across former Russian territories, making Nazi occupation nearly impossible to sustain. Nuclear arms race with Germany. If the Nazis had developed nuclear weapons, a new nuclear arms race would have begun, not between the US and USSR, but between Nazi Germany and the remnants of the Soviet Union. China as an anti-Nazi ally. Mao Zedong's communist movement, which ultimately took control of China in 1949, might have been the perfect breeding ground for an anti-Nazi rebellion, backed by Soviet and American intelligence. The world would have been locked in a three-way struggle between Nazi fascism, American democracy, and Soviet communism, creating an alternate version of the Cold War, one even more dangerous than the real one. The Nazi ideology was built on war, conquest, and racial superiority. But could it have lasted? Internal collapse. The weight of a brutal regime. Empires built on fear rarely last forever. Even within Nazi Germany, cracks would have formed over time. Economic instability. Nazi Germany's economy was fueled by war. Without continuous expansion, its economy might have collapsed under the weight of its own bureaucracy and militarization. Revolts within Nazi-controlled territories. Even after decades of control, nations like France, Poland, and Russia would never have fully accepted Nazi rule. Resistance movements would have continued for generations. Infighting among Nazi leaders. Hitler's inner circle was filled with ambitious, power-hungry men. Without an external enemy, internal power struggles might have torn the Reich apart from within. A world under Nazi rule might have been powerful in the short term, but ultimately unsustainable. Even if Nazi Germany had defeated the Allies, it would not have been the only nation with global ambitions. Japan's independence. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were allies, but how long would that alliance have lasted? Eventually, Japan might have challenged Germany's dominance, leading to new conflicts in Asia. The Middle East's role. Oil-rich nations in the Middle East might have played a crucial role in the global resistance, funding and supporting underground movements against Nazi Germany. History has proven that no empire remains unchallenged forever. Even if Hitler had won World War II, his vision of a thousand-year Reich would have been nothing more than a fantasy. Between underground resistance movements, international espionage, economic instability, and global opposition, Nazi Germany would have faced constant challenges from every corner of the world. Would it have lasted for a decade? Possibly. Would it have lasted a century? Unlikely. Would it have survived forever? Impossible. Resistance is human nature, and no dictatorship can suppress the spirit of freedom forever. If Hitler had won World War II, the world of 2024 would be unrecognizable. The Nazi Empire, stretching across Europe, Asia, and possibly even parts of the Americas, would have reshaped daily life, global politics, and technological progress in unimaginable ways. Would this world be a dominant, stable superpower, or would it be plagued by internal conflicts, rebellions, and economic stagnation? A day in the life of a Nazi-controlled world. The streets are silent except for the rhythmic march of German soldiers. Towering buildings display giant swastikas, and loudspeakers broadcast propaganda, reinforcing the ideology of racial superiority and absolute obedience. Surveillance cameras are installed on every corner, tracking every movement of the people. Education and indoctrination. Schools do not teach independent thinking. Instead, children are trained from an early age to worship the Führer, believe in Nazi ideology, and dedicate their lives to the empire. Scientific discoveries are only pursued if they align with the government's vision. Media and entertainment. Music, films, and literature glorify Hitler and the Nazi Party. Anything that contradicts the state's ideology is banned and destroyed. There is no freedom of speech, only carefully crafted narratives that ensure complete loyalty. Social hierarchy. Society is strictly divided. Aryans are at the top, holding all positions of power, while those deemed inferior live as second-class citizens, or worse, are sent to labor camps. Any sign of rebellion is met with immediate execution or imprisonment. This is not a free world. Imprisonment. This is not a free world. It is a world built on fear, obedience, and absolute control. While the economy may have been strong on the surface, it would have been deeply flawed. A system built on oppression and forced labor cannot sustain itself forever. Technology under the Nazis. Nazi Germany was already ahead in certain fields, such as rocket technology and jet propulsion. A world under Hitler's rule might have seen massive advancements in aerospace technology. The Nazis had begun developing long-range missiles. If they had won, they might have led a global space race, reaching the moon or even Mars before any other nation. Nuclear power and weapons. Hitler was obsessed with nuclear power. Had he won, the world might have lived under the constant threat of Nazi-controlled nuclear dominance, forcing any remaining free nations to submit to German rule. Artificial intelligence and surveillance. With totalitarian control, the Nazis would have developed advanced surveillance technology, AI-driven monitoring systems, and predictive policing, ensuring absolute control over their citizens. Despite these advancements, freedom of thought and creativity would have been stifled, meaning true innovation and progress would have eventually slowed down. Superpower status. Would Nazi Germany have dominated the world? If Hitler had won, Nazi Germany would have undoubtedly become the most powerful nation on Earth. But would it have remained stable? History suggests otherwise. Conflict with Japan and other allies. During World War II, Germany and Japan were allies. But if Germany had won, how long would that alliance have lasted? Japan's growing power. The Japanese Empire had its own vision of dominance, especially in Asia. Eventually, a power struggle between Germany and Japan would have been inevitable. The fall of other Axis powers. Italy and other smaller allies might have rebelled against German control, realizing that they were merely pawns in Hitler's grand vision. Over time, Nazi Germany would have found itself fighting new wars, not just against former enemies, but even against its old allies. The American resistance. Even if Nazi Germany had won the war, the United States would have remained the last major opposition. America, with its nuclear capabilities and massive industrial strength, would have funded underground resistance movements across the world, developed even more powerful nuclear weapons to counter Nazi threats, engaged in a Cold War with Nazi Germany, similar to how the U.S. faced the Soviet Union in our real timeline. This means that the world would never have truly been at peace. Instead, it would have been divided between Nazi-controlled territories and American-led resistance forces, locked in a decades-long power struggle. Would the Nazi world be stable or chaotic? Totalitarian regimes rarely survive in the long run. While Nazi Germany might have appeared stable in the short term, its foundation was too weak to last for centuries. Internal collapse due to oppression, revolts and rebellions. No empire built on fear can remain unchallenged. Secret rebellion movements would have continued to grow in power, eventually shaking the foundation of the Nazi Empire. Economic problems. A system relying on forced labor and oppression would eventually crumble. Once the enslaved populations stopped producing or revolted, Germany's economy would have suffered a massive collapse. Power struggles within the Nazi Party. Hitler was not immortal. If he had died, who would have taken over? Rival Nazi leaders would have turned against each other, leading to internal conflicts that could have weakened the empire from within. A possible Nazi civil war. A world under Hitler's rule would not have remained unified forever. Over time, different Nazi factions would have emerged, each with its own vision of the future. Generations raised under Nazi rule might have begun questioning the system, leading to ideological divides. Oppressed nations would have continued fighting for freedom, creating constant instability. Despite Nazi Germany's military dominance, human nature always seeks freedom. Rebellion is inevitable, and no dictatorship can suppress it forever. The final question, would Hitler's vision have lasted? The answer is simple: no. Even if Hitler had won the war, his empire would have eventually collapsed, either through economic instability, rebellion, or internal power struggles. Totalitarian regimes do not survive forever. People fight back against oppression. Innovation, creativity, and freedom are necessary for a civilization to thrive. Had Nazi Germany ruled the world in 2024, it would have been a dystopian nightmare, one that could never have lasted forever. As we conclude this exploration into a world where Hitler triumphed in World War II, we're left with one essential question. Did history follow its natural course? Could the world we know today, one that, despite its flaws, cherishes freedom, democracy, and human rights, have emerged from a time dominated by the Nazi regime? Had Hitler won, the future we'd have faced would likely have been one of perpetual conflict, oppression, and technological stagnation. But the very thought of a world like that forces us to reflect on the trajectory of our own reality and how the present day might have unfolded if different decisions had been made. Did history follow its natural path? History is shaped by choices, actions, and unforeseen events. When we consider the global conflicts of the past century, it's easy to see how the world was pushed toward its current state. But had Hitler's empire succeeded, history would have taken a very different turn, one filled with darker outcomes. The divergence of history, the outcomes of World War II, had it turned out differently, would have dramatically altered the social, political, and economic structures of the world. Germany's rule over Europe would have meant the erasure of entire cultures and societies, as millions of people would have been subjugated or eradicated to make way for a racially pure empire. The world economy would have been built on the backs of forced labor, creating a global system of exploitation that could never truly be stable. Freedom of thought, culture, and speech would have been silenced, replaced by Nazi propaganda that distorted reality to maintain control. Yet, this wasn't the world that came to pass. The victories of the Allied forces, the defeat of fascism, and the eventual rise of democratic nations meant that the true trajectory of history, however chaotic at times, moved towards a more just world. History did, in many ways, follow its natural course, not because it was inevitable, but because of the resilience and determination of those who stood against tyranny. The battle for the future. Looking back, the rise of democracy, the fight for civil rights, and the global movements to secure freedom and equality show us that humanity's spirit cannot be contained by oppression. Though we face issues of inequality, war, and suffering today, the modern world still holds values that would have been impossible under Nazi rule. Freedom of speech, an essential pillar of democracy that allows us to debate, protest, and create. Cultural diversity. The world's richness in art, music, literature, and thought would have been wiped out under a totalitarian regime like Nazi Germany. Human rights. The idea that every individual deserves dignity, no matter their race, religion, or ethnicity, would have been entirely absent from the Nazi-dominated world. Had Hitler won, those fundamental aspects of the modern world we take for granted would never have existed. It's worth asking ourselves, would we have been willing to fight for them? Could the global resistance have eventually triumphed over the forces of tyranny, or would we have simply been absorbed into a new world order built on fear? The resilience of the human spirit is an undeniable force, but its potential in such a world would have been tested to the extreme. Is our world better? The question we now turn to is whether the world we live in today is better than the one Hitler envisioned. In many ways, the answer is clear. The triumph of democracy, the defeat of Nazi Germany, the fall of the Axis powers, and the rise of democratic systems in Europe, Asia, and the Americas set the stage for the modern world we experience today. Our world is imperfect, yes, but it offers people the right to choose, the right to protest, and the right to express their beliefs freely. The civil rights movement in the U.S., the end of apartheid in South Africa, and the global recognition of LGBTQ+ rights are all evidence of progress. Technological advancements have transformed our lives for the better, from medical breakthroughs to communications that have connected the world in unprecedented ways. Global organizations like the United Nations have allowed nations to work together, negotiate, and address global issues that affect us all, ensuring that the horrors of a world under Nazi rule remain a nightmare of history, not a present reality. The value of human dignity. Had Hitler won, the value of human life would have been subjugated to racial purity. The world would have been a place where millions of people would never have known the freedoms we have today. Under the Nazi regime, human dignity meant nothing. The notion of equality, which is central to modern societies, would have been utterly absent. The eradication of undesirable populations, including Jews, Romani, disabled individuals, and others, would have been the norm rather than the exception. Cultural exchange and collaboration would have been completely stifled by Nazi oppression. Instead, we live in a world where the idea of human dignity is something we can strive for, even if we still fall short at times. The fight for justice is ongoing, but the principles that govern democratic societies today, freedom, equality, and the right to live without fear, are a testament to how far we've come since the defeat of fascism. The end of this thought experiment. What could have been? As we wrap up this exploration of an alternate history, it's important to reflect on the magnitude of the events that didn't happen. Had Hitler won World War II, this video, your access to information, your ability to form your own opinion, may never have reached you. You might not have had the freedom to watch this, to think critically, or to choose what content you consume. A powerful closing thought. In the end, the history we live in today flawed as it may be, is a history built on the ashes of tyranny, oppression, and war. We are the beneficiaries of the sacrifices made by countless individuals who fought for a better world. If Hitler had won, this video might never have reached you. Without the sacrifices made by those who resisted Nazi rule, and without the defeat of fascism, we would have never known the world we live in now, a world full of hope, possibility, and a chance for a better tomorrow.